Welcome back to Tariq Amba Podcast and Videocast. I'm your host, Salawon Kabriye. Previously, in our series on the medieval Solomonic emperors, we had covered the reign of one of Ethiopia's most consequential emperors, Amde Tsion I. As covered in the third and final episode about Emperor Amde Tsion, he died in the year 1344 after a reign of 30 years. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Newaye Christos, which means treasure of Christ. Newaye Christos took the additional throne name of Seife Ar'ed, which translates to fearsome sword. He is most often referred to by this name. Some sources also state that he had the additional throne name of Constantinos. James Bruce, many centuries later, would state that Seife Ar'ed had participated in his father's war against Salih, king of Mora. Taddessa Tamurat, in his book Church and State in Ethiopia, records that Seife Ar'ed had initially submitted to the demands of the Archbishop Abune Yaqub to recall and restore the monks that his father had exiled over their disputes over Amde Tsion I's marriage to his father's concubine. Seife Ar'ed agreed to submit to the laws of the church and to practice monogamy as well. However, he went back on his word and married 3 women. When the archbishop and the leading monks and abbots protested this, the emperor sent the archbishop back to Egypt and exiled the monks to the southern parts of his realm, far from his court. Tekles Adik Mokria notes that while the official royal chronicles note that Seife Ar'ed reigned for 28 years, unlike the chronicles of his father's reign, his are virtually devoid of any detail as to events of his reign. In fact, only a few events deemed significant enough by the chroniclers in his close to 3 decades-long reign to deserve mention. Perhaps unlike his father, Seife Ar'ed did not think that the chronicles were such a priority. One event that was recorded was that he went to Tigray to the Debre Benkul monastery to receive blessings from the very aged monk Abba Medhanina Igzi. After receiving the blessings of this very important church father, the emperor is reported to have marched to Upper Egypt to confront the Mamluk Sultan. The emperor is reported in the chronicle to have battled the ruler of Egypt and forced him to free from imprisonment the 84th Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria. The 84th Patriarch of Alexandria was Pope Margos IV, who reigned from July 15, 1348 to January 31, 1363. During his reign, Egypt was ruled by 3 Mamluk sultans in turn. Sultan Nasser Hassan bin Muhammad had reigned from 1347 to 1351 when he was deposed and replaced by Sultan Salah ed-Din Saleh bin Muhammad from 1351 to 1354. Then, Sultan Nasser Hassan had been restored to his throne from 1354 until 1361 when he was succeeded by Sultan Salah ed-Din Muhammad bin Hagi. This sultan ruled until 1363 when he was succeeded by Sultan Ashraf Zine ed-Din bin Hassan, so it is uncertain which of these sultans were the ones directly involved in this series of events. It is noted by both Arabic and European writers that the reigns of the Mamluk sultans of this period were marked by significant persecution of their Christian and Jewish subjects. In particular, the Coptic Orthodox Patriarchate was under constant demand to pay exorbitant taxes to the state. This was because the Coptic Church was regarded as being greatly enriched by considerable tributes it received from the Christian Nubian kingdoms and the Ethiopian Empire, over which it had episcopal jurisdiction. Resistance to paying these exorbitant taxes resulted in harsh measures, including the imprisonment of the Patriarch. Tekles Adik Mokria voices doubt that the Emperor Seife Ar'ed marched into Upper Egypt and achieved a devastating enough defeat upon the Mamluks to force them to free the Patriarch. But he believes that an alliance of the Emperor of Ethiopia and the Christian kingdoms of Nubia on their southern border would have been threatening enough for the Mamluk sultans to ease persecution of the Coptic hierarchy. Tekles Adik also states that the Ethiopian emperor agreed to lessen the pressure on Ethiopia's Muslim subjects to convert to Christianity, which may have played a role in the freeing of Marcos IV from imprisonment. Taddessa Tamrat, however, states that it was not just the emperor's entry into Upper Egypt with a vast army, but also that the emperor had detained all Egyptian merchants in his kingdom, and that this was what compelled the Mamelukes to free Pope Marcos IV. The Mamelukes sent a delegation to Emperor Seife Ar'ed to convince him to return to his kingdom now that the Coptic patriarch was freed. Seife Ar'ed agreed to go back, but he kept these delegates with him as unwilling guests for a considerable amount of time. Another event of this reign that the chronicles deemed significant enough to mention was the moving of the remains of Saint Tekle Haymanot to a new tomb. The veneration of Saint Tekle Haymanot was firmly cemented in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church by this time, and so this event was of great significance. The emperor would have played a large role in these ceremonies. Like his father, Seife Ar'ed faced numerous challenges from his vassals, the Walasma sultans of Yifat. Sultan Ali bin Sabr ad-Din rose in rebellion, and after a lengthy campaign through the Adal and Yifat territories, Sultan Ali was defeated and captured together with all of his sons. The emperor took the opportunity to try and weaken the Walasmas by imprisoning all their heirs, much as the Solomonic princes were all imprisoned. Seife Ar'ed allowed only one of the sultan's sons to remain free, and he installed him as Sultan Ahmed Harb Arad. The former Sultan, Ali, had been taken to Shoa with his other sons and detained at Emperor Seife Ar'ed's court for 8 years. He was accorded all the personal dignities he had previously enjoyed as Sultan and lived comfortably in close daily contact with the emperor and his family. Over this time, a personal rapport had grown between the emperor and the deposed sultan, and his previous rebellion was forgiven. Emperor Seife Ar'ed restored Sultan Ali as the ruler of Yifat after 8 years, displacing Sultan Ahmad bin Arad. Indeed, Sultan Ali had returned to Yifat deeply embittered against his son, and as a result, Sultan Ahmed and his direct descendants were regarded as traitors and outcasts by the rest of the Walasma clan. Defeated by his father's forces, Sultan Ahmed appealed to Emperor Seife Ar'ed, who appointed him as ruler of the small district of Gabert in compensation for his loss of Yifat. However, Sultan Ahmed of Gabert died not long after receiving this appointment. His father, Sultan Ali, as overlord of the Muslims in the Ethiopian Empire, was eager to erase his traitor son's legacy, and so he quickly appointed one of his other sons, Abu Bakr bin Ali, as ruler of Gabert. However, the son of the late Sultan Ahmad, Haq ad-Din, would have none of this, and in defiance of his grandfather Sultan Ali, he rose in rebellion and drove out his uncle Abu Bakr. Another son of Sultan Ali and uncle of Haq ad-Din, named Maula Asfa, rallied the forces of Yifat to put down this rebellion by Haq ad-Din and tried to take over Gabert. The young Haq ad-Din, however, was repeatedly victorious and began to gather an ever greater following not just in Gabert but in Yifat itself. Maula Asfa appealed directly to the emperor for assistance. The emperor sent repeated reinforcements to shore up Sultan Ali and his son Maula Asfa, but again and again Haq ad-Din was victorious. Ultimately, Maula Asfa was killed in battle, and Haq ad-Din bin Ahmad entered Yifat and seized the reins of power in the Sultanate of Yifat. He did not, however, depose his aged grandfather Sultan Ali, allowing him to live out his days as Sultan, although powerlessly. Eventually, when Sultan Ali died, his grandson assumed the Sultanate as Sultan Haq ad-Din II. Although both Sultan Haq ad-Din II and his brother and eventual successor Sultan Sa'ad al-Din II were born close to the Ethiopian court in Togulet, both would become much stricter Muslims than their close Walasma predecessors and led an Islamist revival in their fiefdom. Haq ad-Din in particular was greatly respected for the depth of his Islamic learning and his devotion to his faith. Upon taking power, Haq ad-Din II had allowed his grandfather, Sultan Ali, to live out his reign as Sultan in Yifat, but he himself established a new seat of power at Wahal, sometimes called Wafat, on the Harar Plateau. This move helped to maintain the autonomy of the weakened Yifat Sultanate within the Ethiopian Empire by distancing it from the center at Tuglat, but it also effectively ended Yifati hegemony over neighboring Muslim kingdoms of Dawaro, Hadiya, and Bali, and all remaining influence in the former Sultanate of Shoa, which became fully incorporated into the Christian province of Shoa. The Walasma Civil War did much to weaken both the Sultanate of Yifat and the dynasty, and is counted as the beginning of the decline of the power of the sultans. Taddessa Tamrat marks the move by Sultan Haq ad-Din II from the city of Yifat to the Harar Plateau as the beginning of what would become the Walasma-ruled Adal Sultanate, which would replace the original Yifat Sultanate of the Walasmas. Count Rossini discusses a fascinating document found inside an old gospel in the Abba Meta monastery in Sanafi, known as Abba Libanos Monastery. This document is a decree that women would be forbidden from entering the Abba Meta monastery. What is most interesting about this document is what it tells us about Seife Ar'ed's court. First, while the official chronicle states that the emperor's given name was Newaye Christos and his throne name was Seife Ar'ed, this document treats Seife Ar'ed as the emperor's given name and gives him the throne name of Konstantinos. Tekles Adikmokrea speculates that this might have been because there was a dispute among factions of the clergy in Ethiopia over what the emperor's throne name should be. Clearly, the monks at this monastery believed that his throne name should be Konstantinos. This decree is issued in the name of the emperor and two other great officials of the empire. One was the new archbishop Abune Salama III, and the other was Melaka Bahar Blaine Saggad. Tekles Adikmokrea believes that the title of Melaka Bahar was what eventually evolved into the Bahar Negash title of the rulers of the maritime districts of the northern portion of the empire that covered much of what is now present-day Eritrea. After a reign of 28 years, Seife Ar'ed, or Newaye Christos, or Konstantinos, died in 1372. He was succeeded by his son Newaye Mariam, or Gift of Mary, who received the throne name of Wudim Asfara. Some sources refer to him as Girma Asfara. The royal chronicles merely state that this emperor was the son of Seife Ar'ed, that he reigned for 10 years, and that his reign was without history or uneventful. Tekles Adikmokrea finds this hard to believe, and thinks that there may have been a lack of qualified scribes. Tekles Adikmokrea also points to the fact that the date of Sultan Haq ad-Din II's death in battle against the Emperor of Ethiopia places it during the reign of Newaye Mariam in 1373 or 1374. So clearly, this reign was not without history. Foreign sources have mistakenly stated that the Sultan was fighting Emperor Dawit I, but the dates contradicts this. The emperor in 1373-74 was Newaye Mariam. Sultan Haq ad-Din II is said to have battled against Seife Ar'ed and his successor Newaye Mariam 20 times over 9 years before being killed in battle. He was succeeded as Walasma Sultan by his brother Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din II. In 1382, upon the death of Emperor Newaye Mariam, his younger brother was crowned as Emperor Dawit I. Now there is some dispute in the numerology of this monarch as Emperor Dawit I, as some sources call him Dawit II. The reason that those sources call him Dawit II is that they count Dawit I as being King David of the Old Testament, the father of King Solomon, the founder of the Solomonic dynasty. However, he is the first emperor in Ethiopia to use the name Dawit, and so I will call him Dawit I. Dawit I received the additional throne name of Konstantinos, much as his father had. Seife Ar'ed notes that Dawit I ordered annual memorial services to be performed for his parents, Emperor Seife Ar'ed and Empress Lezaborka, in perpetuity at the island monasteries of Tanay Kirkos and Kibran Gabriel. Indeed, we know the name of Empress Lezaborka thanks to this written order issued to these monasteries, as the royal chronicles do not mention her or the two other queens of Seife Ar'ed by name at all. Dawit I had two known wives, Empress Sion Mogasa and Empress Igzi Kibra. The royal chronicles state that Dawit I reigned for 29 years. Yet the book Seife Tefut states the rather exact figure that Emperor Dawit I reigned for 32 years, 6 months, and 9 days. However, the document issued in the emperor's name ordering the memorial service for his parents kept at Tana monasteries states that it was issued in the 34th year of his reign. Dawit I appears to have been a military man in the mold of Amde Tsion I. It certainly appears from most accounts that a significant period of his reign was devoted to military campaigns. Rebellions by the Muslim vassals, particularly the Walasma sultans, continued to preoccupy his reign much as it had his predecessors and would continue to do so under his successors. Seife states that Ethiopia was unable to end these constant rebellions largely due to the encouragement these vassals were getting from Muslim powers in the region, particularly Yemen and Egypt. The Ayyubid and then the Rasulid dynasties that presided over Yemen from the city of Zabid not only incited the Yifat, Hadiyya, and Adal sultanates against the Christian emperors and provided weapons and fighters to help them, but also provided sanctuary to rebellious leaders when they were defeated and were forced to flee. The Mamluks of Egypt were also eager to incite rebellion among the Muslim population against the Christian monarchy. The Aksumites had once been a significant naval power, but that was long gone at that point, and Ethiopia did not have the ability to strike at the forces in Yemen, which perhaps would have cooled the repeated rebellions among its vassals. Emperor Dawit I's reign covered the end of the Rasulid Sultan al-Ashraf Ismail I and much of the reign of Sultan ad-Nasr Ahmed in Yemen. Yemenite support continued unabated thanks to, in a big part, due to Ethiopia's lack of naval power. Emperor Dawit I's reign, however, saw a major shift in the fate of the Muslim vassal states. Sa'ad ad-Din II, Walaspa Sultan of Yifat, rebelled against the emperor and fought against imperial forces at a place called Ahbazah. He was captured, but was quickly rescued by his own men and defeated one of Emperor Dawit's commanders named Aman Murfa. He took control of the territory of the Zallan tribe, a Muslim group allied with the emperor, and seized a great deal of loot. The battle, however, did cost the Sultan the life of one of his important commanders, his brother-in-law named Salim bin Ayyad. Sa'ad ad-Din II is said to have been born at Zayla, but there are other sources, such as Taddisa Tamarat, that maintain that he was among the Walasma princes born and raised at the court of Emperor Seife Ar'ed in Toglet. Emperor Dawit I could not let this defeat stand. Dawit I moved his court to Tulk in Fatagar to be closer to the theater of battle, but did not take direct command himself. Instead, he sent a new force under the command of a man named Zanhak, who marched into Yifat and battled one of the Sultan's commanders named Asad and defeated him. He then confronted an even larger army under Emir Mahmud and annihilated it, leaving only one horseman alive to carry the news of this crushing defeat to the Sultan. Before the Sultan could even digest the news of these reversals, Sa'ad ad-Din II came under direct attack by another force sent by Emperor Dawit I under the command of a man named Barwa and was defeated. Sa'ad ad-Din II fled the field of battle and took refuge at the port of Zayla. The imperial forces pursued him there and laid siege to the city. The residents of Zela were decimated by lack of water or food during the long siege, and their attempts to break the siege were futile. The emperor's forces stormed the town and destroyed much of it. Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din was killed in the battle, having suffered a blow to his forehead. Al-Makrizi writes that the Sultan died in the Islamic Hijra year of 805 or 1402 in the Gregorian calendar, and that he had reigned as Walasma Sultan of Yifat for 30 years. His children fled for their lives and scattered across the Arab world, and the power of the Muslim vassals in Ethiopia declined. With the death of the Walasma Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din II, the Sultanate of Yifat suffered its final collapse. The lesser Muslim vassal states of Dawaro and Hadiya were able to emerge from under Yifati domination and exert their own influence independent of the Walasmas, and now interacted with the Emperor of Ethiopia directly. The Walasmas were no longer their overlords. However, the Walasmas were not done. Sa'ad ad-Din II's son, Sabr ad-Din, would eventually return from his exile in Yemen and formally establish the Sultanate of Adal, which would become the new seat of the Walasma dynasty for the rest of its existence. Sa'ad ad-Din II's tomb at Zela was a venerated site for the Sufi Muslims of the region for centuries. The explorer Richard Burton visited it in 1854 and described it as a great mound of rough stones surrounding an upright pole. It would eventually be destroyed by the encroaching sea, and there is no trace of it today. The islands off the coast of Zela are named the Sa'ad ad-Din Islands in honor of the last Walasma Sultan of Yifat. What is interesting about this episode is that Dawit I moved his court to Tulk but did not directly participate in this war, preferring to send his commanders instead. Given his military reputation, one wonders why he chose to sit this particular war out. Dawit I is also said to have put down a significant rebellion by his Jewish subjects. The Falasha, or Beta Israel Jews, were centered at that time in the north in the district of Simin. Regretfully, details of this rebellion and Emperor Dawit's actions there have not survived. Dawit I also worked hard to ensure that the Orthodox Church was firmly entrenched in those parts of Gojam where it had not yet been spread. Dawit I, early in his reign, entered into a conflict with Mamluk Egypt in which he appears to have played a much more direct role. Tekles Adik Mokre quotes Al-Makrizi as saying that just as his father Seife Ar'ed had marched into Upper Egypt in response to the persecution of Christians by the Mamelukes, Emperor Dawit I did the same, leading his army as far as Aswan and withholding all trade from Upper Nile regions to Egypt. There are accounts that the emperor intended to continue marching north and that his ultimate goal was to reach Jerusalem itself. Al-Makrizi says that the emperor kept all merchants from entering Egypt, causing great misery there, and also pressured his Muslim subjects to convert. Some sources state that Dawit I threatened the Mamelukes that he would divert the Nile and starve Egypt, much in the way that his ancestors had threatened them before. Fear that Ethiopia could or would attempt to divert the Nile River was an issue that would cast a long shadow over relations with Egypt across the centuries, even up to present times. Indeed, it has become a significant issue in recent years. The panicked Mamelukes ordered the Coptic Patriarch, Pope Matthias I, who reigned from 1378 to 1408, to send a delegation to Emperor Dawit to get him to allow the merchants to resume their trading and to turn back from Aswan and halt his advance. It so happened that the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Johannes, was also present in Cairo and was asked to head the delegation. With news of this high-ranking delegation's arrival, Dawit I sent a huge escort to receive them. While some sources have him meeting the delegation at Aswan, others state that he met them in Sena, in what is now the Sudan. Al-Makrizi maintains that the emperor met them in Aksum, but wherever they met, the talks were a success, Sultan al-Salih freed the Coptic Pope from detention and lessened his persecution of the Copts as a result of this event, and Emperor Dawit turned his forces back from Aswan and allowed the merchants to resume their trading. In gratitude, the patriarchs asked the emperor what they could do to repay him. He asked for a piece of the Holy Cross. The Patriarch of Jerusalem granted that wish, and the piece of the Holy Cross, along with an icon of Christ wearing the crown of thorns and one of the Holy Virgin, reputedly painted by St. Luke himself, were sent to Ethiopia. The piece of the Holy Cross, said to be a large piece, and the icons were allowed to pass through Egypt unmolested. Emperor Dawit I went beyond Ethiopia's borders into Sennar to receive these holy relics. The people of the country are said to have flocked to the borders to welcome the Holy Cross and received it with garlands of flowers and the singing of hymns and cheering and illuminating, and large torchlight processions. The piece of the Holy Cross that was carried in great processions into Tuglet and placed in a church built to house it next to the emperor's palace would become among the most venerated icons in Ethiopia. The ceremonies were carried out with great pomp in the emperor's presence. This large piece of the Holy Cross is said to have reached Ethiopia on Mascaram 10th or September 20th on the Gregorian calendar. And so, on that day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church celebrates the holiday of Tekazal Tsigge. Tsigge is the season of flowering that follows the Ethiopian rainy season, which occurs from June to early September every year. The word Tsigge refers to the flowers themselves. This flowering season is used by the Church as a symbol of the flowering of faith. The Old Testament of the Bible refers to the two great pillars on either side of the entrance to the Temple of Solomon that were topped by figures of flowers. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church regards these pillars as a foreshadowing of the apostles Peter and Paul, and the flowers as the Christian faith that these two saints upheld and spread in the world. So the season of flowering was used as a metaphor of the flowering and spreading of the faith. The arrival of the Holy Cross in Ethiopia on that date represented the ultimate flowering of the faith and was celebrated as such. Because Emperor Dawit I was responsible for the arrival of the Holy Cross, this holiday was also known as Ya'az Meskal, or the Emperor's Holy Cross. It was always celebrated by clergy with a grand ceremony in the presence of the reigning emperor in the courtyard in front of his palace until the revolution of 1974. The ceremony was abolished following the seizure of power by the Marxist Derg in 1974, but was revived after the fall of the Derg and held before the Patriarch at one of Addis Ababa's major churches in turn. The piece of the Holy Cross, known as Gmada Meskal, became one of the most revered relics in the country, and it was moved from place to place, being kept for periods of time at various great churches and monasteries across the land. Eventually, Emperor Zara Yacob had it taken to Gishan Debra Karbe Monastery. This ancient monastery of the Virgin Mary is located on Amba Gishan, a mountain with sheer cliffs all around that is in the shape of a cross. This impregnable Amba had served as one of the places where Ethiopian emperors imprisoned their male relatives to prevent rival claimants from raising rebellions. Close to the Church of St. Mary, the emperor had the piece of the Holy Cross placed in an iron chest, decorated heavily with gold and jewels, and buried it deep in the center of this cross-shaped mountain, or Amba. The Church of God the Father, Seife Ar'ed, was built over the spot where it was buried. To this day, the monastery and its churches are a major site of pilgrimage at the Feast of Meskal on September 17, which celebrates the finding of the true cross by the Roman Empress Helena, or Eleni, mother of Constantine the Great. Not all sources agree that this conflict and its resolution is what brought this relic of the true cross to Ethiopia, but more on that later. Emperor Dawit I's relationship with Egypt improved immensely after this episode, especially when Al-Malik al-Zahir Seife Ad-Din Barkuk deposed the last of a series of child sultan Al-Salih Haji and took the Mamluk throne of Egypt for himself. Barkuk was born in Circassia and had been acquired as a slave and became a Mamluk and rose in prominence over many years. Since 1341, the Mamluk Empire had been ruled by the descendants of Al-Nasr Muhammad, but for much of that time, many of them had been child sultans used by puppets by more powerful Mamluk officials. Now Barkuk seized power for himself and established the Burj dynasty of the Mamluk Empire, and he took the name Al-Zahir in imitation of Sultan Baybars, who also used that name. Sultan Barkuk was the sultan that ended the official celebration of the Old Coptic New Year of Nowruz. Emperor Dawit I is said to have sent Sultan Barkuk a lavish caravan of 22 camels laden with gifts. The caravan included jugs made of pure gold filled with beads of gold shaped in the form of chickpeas. The Sultan and his court were overwhelmed and very impressed by this lavish gift. It is not known what Barkuk responded with. Dawit I was a deeply devout man who greatly encouraged and firmly established the veneration of the Holy Cross and the Virgin Mary in Ethiopia. Emperor Dawit's commissioned translation of the Miracles of Mary from Arabic is the oldest surviving illustrated book commissioned by an Ethiopian emperor. The Miracles of Mary, or Amde Mariam, are among the most popular prayers in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, regularly recited at church ceremonies. These played a huge role in the increase of the veneration of the Virgin Mary in Ethiopia during the reign of Dawit I, which continues to this day. He also commissioned a beautifully illuminated copy of the Holy Gospels, which is in the possession of the monastery of the Archangel Gabriel on Kibran Island on Lake Tana. Now, back to the piece of the Holy Cross that was brought to Ethiopia. There is another version of how it was acquired. In 1402, Emperor Dawit I sent an embassy to Europe, which was received in Venice on June 23rd of that year. It caused quite a sensation across Europe. Dawit had been inspired to send these envoys after meeting European travelers or merchants who had come to his realm. When they had been brought before him, he had quizzed them to determine whether they were in fact Christians, and had been intrigued by their responses about Europe. Their accounts of great Christian states in Europe were confirmed by Abuna Bartholomeus, the newly arrived Coptic archbishop. This being a time in history when holy relics were deeply revered across Christendom, these visitors had apparently told the emperor about the many holy relics located in Europe, including fragments of the true cross. And so, the emperor determined to reach out to these Christian lands. Dawit I's envoys brought with them 4 tame leopards and would spend about 2 months in Venice. Taddessa Tamrat states that the purpose of this mission was to seek military and technical assistance to help the emperor in his quest to defeat the Muslim foes, internal and external, that had plagued his empire for so long. Other historians have echoed this belief. However, in a groundbreaking work, Verena Krebs, professor at Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany, says that the emperor was motivated by something completely different. She argues in her book Medieval Ethiopian Kingship, Craft and Diplomacy with Latin Europe that Dawit I sent these envoys to seek out holy relics, elaborate fabrics for both ecclesiastic and royal vestments, and craftsmen to decorate the magnificent churches he wanted to build in his country. The chief envoy of the Emperor of Ethiopia to Venice was a man named Antonius Bartholdi, and he was originally from Florence. How he came to be in Ethiopia and end up on a mission for its emperor in Venice is not stated, but the gifts he brought from what the Europeans still referred to as Prester John were commented on in letters between members of the Signoria, Venice's governing council, and the Lord of Padua, Francesco Novello de Carrara. They described wondrous things such as the hide of a multicolored donkey and the hide of a wild man. These are presumably the skins of a zebra and a monkey or an ape of some kind. Also, among the gifts were an array of marvelous spices and a giant pearl, and of course, the 4 live leopards and other unspecified wonders. The Venetian Signoria allocated the handsome sum of 1,000 ducats to purchase appropriate return gifts to be sent to the Emperor of Ethiopia. In exchange for the beautiful pearl, which was reported to be 12 carats or more, the Venetians sent a magnificent chalice of gilded silver worked in the niello style, where black metallic decoration is etched onto the metal. This chalice was taken from the treasury of St. Mark's Basilica and may have been the one seen many years later in Ethiopia by Francisco Alferez in the early 1520s. Dr. Krebs writes that the records show that in response to a specific request from Emperor Dawit I, the Venetian council sent 5 craftsmen to Ethiopia to help him in his quest to beautify his churches. Included in this group was a man named Victus, who was a painter from Florence, an unnamed Neapolitan man who was an armorer, and 3 men named Antonius. Antonius of Florence was a wall builder, Antonius of Tarvisio was a brick and tile maker, and another Antonius of Florence who was brought out of prison for this mission and who was an expert carpenter. The embassy with these 5 workmen set out from Venice at the end of August 1402 and were received by the Duke of Candia, who was the Venetian governor of Crete, and presented him with a letter of commendation from the Signoria in order to guarantee their safe passage. It is not known and is often debated whether or not this embassy ever made it back to Ethiopia. Some believe that they perished and never returned. Others believe that they did make it back, hence the lavish chalice that Father Alvarez saw a century later. Certain accounts state that this embassy was the real source of the Peace of the Holy Cross received by Dawit I, and this embassy, passing through Jerusalem and Egypt, brought the cross to Ethiopia on Mascaram 10, and that the story of Emperor Dawit receiving the relic from the patriarchs of Egypt and Jerusalem is an error or a distortion of the actual history. It is an interesting debate. Krebs quotes a Ge'ez homily on the wood of the true cross, that upon hearing of the return of his envoys from Venice, that Dawit clapped his hands and stamped his feet with joy, and led his priests and troops in a joyous procession around his church to celebrate. The Arabic History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria says that the emperor removed his crown and prostrated himself on the ground for an hour, worshipping, rejoicing, and marveling upon receiving the holy relics and the magnificent fabrics and robes brought back by his envoys. So it would seem evidence indicates that they made it to Ethiopia safely. The Ge'ez Dirsana is a Meskel by Abba Kyriakos, homily on the wood of the true cross, describes the beauty of the chalice brought by the embassy in wondrous terms. It states that the base had images of the 4 evangelists, the 12 apostles and angels framed by columns and scrollwork, and that around the rim was an inscription in Greek letters which translates to, "Take and drink of this chalice, it is my blood which is shed for your sake." Father Francisco Alvarez, a century later, wrote about being shown a silver-gilt chalice with the 12 apostles around the base, with a Latin inscription around the rim of the very similar quote. It would seem that it was the same Venetian chalice taken from the Basilica of St. Mark in Venice a century earlier. Krebs also cites the Dirsana is a Meskel as saying that the gifts included lavish church vestments that included images of the Virgin Mary, Christ, the holy angels, and were made of fine fabrics. Magnificent embroidered hangings were also included, engraved mirrors, and a relic reported to be the whole body of one of the holy innocents massacred in Bethlehem by King Herod, encased in an urn decorated with rock crystal. There is record of much lavish jewelry and embroidered clothing for the emperor, including clothes with images of lions and birds, a shirt with a cross embroidered on it surrounded by the words "God is with us" in Latin, and rich fabrics for large royal tents, and a large, magnificent musical mechanical clock. There was also a letter from the Doge of Venice written in gold ink and bearing a gold seal. Intriguingly, Dr. Krebs indicates that this may not have been the only embassy sent by Dawit I to the Italian peninsula, and indeed that it may have been one of three. There are accounts of two separate embassies that visited Rome to pay court to the Pope and sought to acquire holy relics in 1402 and 1404. I encourage those interested in these fascinating accounts to read Dr. Verena Krebs' book. On October 6, 1413, Emperor Dawit I was killed when he was apparently kicked in the head by one of his horses. His body was interred in the Daga Stephanos Monastery, or the Monastery of St. Stephen on Daga Island of Lake Dana. He would be succeeded in turn by a series of sons and grandsons before the succession of one of the greatest of Ethiopian monarchs in any age, his youngest son, Zara Yacob. We will cover that story on our next episode of Tarikamba. Thank you for joining us at Tarikamba. Please like and share this episode with anyone you think would be interested. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and or your favorite podcast platform. We are on Anchor Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And follow us on social media and visit our website at www.tarikamba.com for additional information, and send any questions or comments to me at solomon@tarikamba.com. Thank you.